The second gate of grief is the parts of us that have never known love. And this is what comes in my door as a therapist, is all the parts of us that we've learned to hate or despise or hold contempt for, or that we were told were unworthy of welcome. My sadness, my neediness, my loneliness, my anger, my exuberance, my sensuality, my curiosity, whatever it is, we get a very clear sense in our families, in our educational systems, in our religious systems, what parts of us are allowed and what parts aren't. Like you were saying, you know, that sadness suddenly got put out in the Irish culture. So you had to hide that. Well, that's a banished part of us. And so it's, in a sense, it's a loss to our integrity as a human being.
Yeah.
Every loss to us should be a place of grief. But we've also been taught to relate to these parts of us with contempt. And we
Mm.
cannot grieve for what we hold with judgment. So that's
Yeah.
kind of the another place where this becomes a never-ending circle of, you know, unmetabolized sorrow. So in the second gate of grief, we're asked to begin to repair these relationships we have with what I call our outcast others. Um, they are banished, and our job is to begin to invite them in to
Yeah.
some sense of return.
Yeah. In the book, you quote I forgot who it is, about the necessity of loving those parts that we held in contempt. I think it was the crouched parts of ourselves that block the way to and from the soul's hall.
Oh yes, that was Denise
Denise
Levertov.
Denise
Yeah,
Leventhal.
beautiful little poem. She said, "To speak of sorrow works upon it, moves it from its crouched place, barring the way to and from the soul's hall."
Mm.
So if we don't speak of sorrow, if we don't talk about these outcast parts of us, there's a blockage even to our own soul as a consequence. And then we feel cold and empty and basically just kind of performing our lives.
Mm.
So this second gate of grief is a crucial part of our repair, and it's rooted extensively in self-compassion. I
Yes.
wrote, I wrote about how the work of grieving opens us up to compassion for other people's suffering. But I neglected to write in the book that in order to grieve my own suffering, I have to have self-compassion.
Yeah, you mention in the book about premature revelation, and it's about letting the grief ripen and getting to know that sense of it in yourself. And I think that's a very wise thing to to know, because once you really embody it and feel it and know it in yourself, then you can share it in its fullness and come to love it as part of you. And then it can be healed and shared, perhaps in a ritual, or with a trusted friend.
Mhm. Yeah, we are uncannily good at sharing our most vulnerable parts of ourselves to the wrong people.
Yeah.
So that is a wise thing to practice restraint, which I think I've said in the book was one of the least developed spiritual values in Western culture. We don't know how to hold things, to let things
Mm.
ripen over time. You can let people know that you're sad and that you're grieving, but then the delicate process of revelation requires some level of maturation of that feeling state and again a holding space strong enough to really protect what I'm sharing in a sacred way.
Yeah, in your book, you mention this concept of benevolent solitude, and I think that that creates the container where all this can happen. And I guess I took what you meant to that to be things like journaling, um, taking walks in nature, self care. Um, you mentioned meditation and yeah, self compassionate practices.
Yeah, unfortunately, most of our time with our grief is isolation, not solitude.
Yes.
We deny ourselves the privilege of being able to be with it and also to share it wisely. So what I mean by benevolent solitude is turning toward the grief with an open heart and a compassionate heart, to sit
Mm.
with the sorrow, to sit with the grief as it is, and not try to change it, not try to make it, go away, not try to get beyond it, but to really become a good host. I think I told the story in the book of a young woman that I was working with who was going through a very difficult divorce. And she said to me one session, I hate going home at night. I said, why is that? She said, when I get home, the house is dark, it's cold, it's empty. I'm just reminded of how lonely I am. And I said to her, can you imagine it as the holiest time of day? That when you open the door, you're meeting the most vulnerable part of you. And could you say to this vulnerable sister, I'm home. Let's turn the stove on. Let's make some soup. Let's make some tea. I have a blanket for you. Let's talk about our day. Let's talk about what's present.
Mm.
And in that moment, I remembered a line of Rainer Maria Rilke, the Austrian poet, where he said, I am too alone. And let's see, how did it go? I am too alone in my life, but not alone enough to make every moment holy. Now that's a beautiful thing he did, where our isolation, I am too alone in the world. We know that feeling, right? But then he makes this pivot, but not alone enough to make every moment holy. Ah, that's
Yeah.
benevolent solitude. That's
Mm.
holy grace. That's creating a spaciousness for all of what I'm experiencing. And that's beautiful.
Yeah.
So
It
the
sounds like
third,
the Yeah,
uh,
just before we move on to the third
yeah,
gate, I'd just like to ask you about shame. You mentioned that briefly in your book, and it sounds like you had prior experience working with that. And it strikes me that shame is a real, perhaps key, getting to know the parts of ourselves we're shameful of. It could be a key to the second gateway of grief of the parts of ourselves that haven't known love.
yeah, thanks for bringing that back up, Connor. Shame is oftentimes the reason why these parts of us have been outcast. We've been told they're not worthy of belonging. They're not worthy of inclusion in my sense of self. And so it's oftentimes shame for being who we are. Erotic creatures, sensual creatures, emotive creatures, needy creatures. And we are told that those are not appropriate ways to be human. And so shame, yeah, I've worked a lot with that thread of shame, gave hundreds and hundreds of talks on shame in my lifetime. And that feeling of shame is caused by a rupture in the continuum of connection between me and someone who I value, someone whom to I'm looking for some sense of welcome and belonging. So when that's ruptured, that sense of being kind of propelled back into my own isolation is unbearable.
Yeah.
So I will do whatever I can. I will shape a self in whatever way I can that will at least approximate what I think you will tolerate.
Mm.
And then maybe I'll at least have a provisional welcome in your world and I won't be utterly exiled. But that self that I fashion based on shame and accommodation is not genuine. It's
Mm.
my fabrication so I don't have to be alone. So again, to heal shame, I say three movements are necessary. The first one is to move from contempt, from worthlessness to wounded. Because if I see these parts of me as worthless, there's no way that there will be any reconciliation, any healing. But if I can begin to see that this is a wounded part of me, that evokes the second movement, which is from contempt to compassion. So if I can see it now as a wound, maybe I can ease off the mantle of contempt and begin to put the warm jacket of compassion around it.
Mm.
And if that happens, the third option is possible, which is to move from silence to sharing. Because silence is the petri dish in which shame multiplies. Sharing is the restoration, it's the reparation of my felt sense of being a participant back in the commons of the community.
Right.
but again, wisely shared. As
Yeah.
Goethe would say, tell a wise person or else stay silent, for the masked man will mock it right away. So choosing wisely, where do I share this shame brother, this shame sister, this shame other that's with
Mm.
me? Where do I share that? Be careful
Yeah.
where you.
Yeah. And one thing that struck me that could be related to that in how we relate to others is what you said in the book about ascension and dissension. It's like we're in an ascension culture. Everything has to be bright and new and shiny and happy, and it's those parts of ourselves that sometimes the more instinctual perhaps parts that we can go into that have the answers, uh, and we can be shameful of them.
Yeah, they're certainly carrying a tremendous amount of our vitality. There's a wonderful line from William Blake who said, we must first go to heaven for form, and then we must go to hell for energy, and then marry the two.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Brilliant, huh?
Yeah.
So we have this heavenly shape that we make of ourselves. We're shiny, we're bright, we've got it all together. But our vitality, he said, we have to go to hell for energy. So whatever, as Jung would say, whatever we repressed into the shadow, that's oftentimes where our vitality is lingering.
Mm.
And then we must marry the two, so that who I'm showing myself to be in the world is also entangled with my own vitality, my own wildness, my own sense of, you know, aliveness. That has to
Yes.
be part of who I am in the world.
And of course, as you mentioned in the book, Jung has also said that what we repress into our shadows, those parts of ourselves, they don't stay there passively, they regress, and then we can act them out in ways that are a bit too wild in a negative way, like
Yes,
violently. And
yes, yeah. I mean, the fiercer we are with trying to project a positive, clean image, these other parts will crack through that veneer. And I mean, that happened, for me many times when I tried to be the nice boy. I'm such a nice guy. Well, suddenly I'd find myself in a rage,
yeah.
not angry, enraged, because
Mm.
there was the regressed and more primitive form of anger that was coming out of me in a
Mm.
rageful way and intimidating people I cared about. But, when you're trying to reinforce an image because you're afraid of being shamed and you're afraid of being banished, again,
You've
you
got a
try
lot
to,
invested in that. Yeah.
you've got a lot invested in that image. Absolutely.
Mm.
Absolutely. So to bring these outcast brothers and sisters and others back makes us more human again. They are actually the ones that allowed me to feel like I belonged.
Mm.
My needy brother, my weak brother, my inadequate brother, they made me human again, perfectly ordinary. I always tried to be special. I always tried to be, extraordinary because I didn't feel my ordinary self was ever going to be worthy of belonging.
Yeah.
I had to be more than. Well, and I can't show you my vulnerability. I can't show you my weakness. I can't tell you I'm in need or that I'm sad. That isolates me even further in the community of people.